But I got to tell you the truth. There's one thing that's going to short-circuit that if we're not able to bring it under control really fast. And that's the other job we've got to do. Besides this basically local job of making our economies work, of building up from the bottom all these beautiful things, we also have, in very short order, got to come together as a globe on the other pressing job of our time, which is this absolutely mandatory task of staunching the flow of carbon into the atmosphere all over the globe. Because that's the thing that will prevent us from having the 100 years or the 50 years or whatever it's going to take to build out this beautiful world that's coming. No kidding, we're at the edge of an absolute civilizational challenge. That's what I told you a minute ago about all the things that are going on around the world as we sit here, the Arctic melting, the oceans acidifying, on and on and on. Pakistan going to 129 degrees. Well, that's with 1 degree rise in the global average temperature. That's how much human beings have raised the temperature so far around the globe. The climatologists are completely clear that unless we rapidly make the transition off fossil fuel, really rapidly, much more rapidly than political or economic systems currently want to do, that we'll see 5 or 6 or 7 degrees of temperature increase before the century is out. That's not the worst case scenario, that's the absolute middle of the line consensus on what's going to happen. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we cannot, dare not find out what 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 degrees will do, because everything we know tells us it'll do terrible, terrible things. And when it does those terrible things, it will undermine all the other work that we're trying to do. That is, you can be the best organic farmer in the world with the best local food systems supported by the best loans from your neighbors to make things happen. And if it rains 30 days in a row, or if it never rains, then you're out of luck. Then the system breaks. All of it's dependent at some level on the world operating at least a little like the world that we're used to. And that's not going to be a possibility if we make the temperature of the planet warmer than it's been for hundreds of millions of years, which is exactly what we're talking about doing. So I'm going to finish with a little pitch for help in this global task too. It's a very daunting sounding task. And in fact, it's maybe an impossible task. It's a very huge one. But I want you to know that around the world, people are taking it up. 2 years ago, we started this thing called 350.org after Jim Hansen at NASA, our greatest climatologist, and his team put out a paper that said we now know enough to know what the bottom line for the planet is. They said any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. That's strong language, and it's stronger language when you know that outside today, in here today, the CO2 concentration is about 390 parts per million and rising about 2 parts per million per year. That is, we're already way too high. That's why the Arctic is melting. That's why we need such an incredibly quick shift in how we power our lives. And it's why we started trying to do this global organizing at 350.org. Now, I'm got to confess that I'm no expert on any of this, particularly on political organizing. Okay, I'm a complete amateur when I began. In fact, the very first thing we did was a march across Vermont that there are some people here who were part of in 2006. We walked for 5 days from Robert Frost's old riding cabin up in the Green Mountains up to Burlington. And the night before we went into Burlington, in fact, we camped down in this field here at Shelburne Farms before we walked down, and it was wonderful. We walked into Burlington with 1,000 people, which those of you who are visitors here, 1,000 people in Vermont. Except for UVM hockey games, that's really about as many people as you get at any one thing. And it was enough to get all of our politicians to come, and all of them, including the Republicans, to sign on to our demands. But the scary thing was to read the newspaper the next morning and see that 1,000 people was the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the U.S. When we read that, we were like, whoa, no wonder we're losing, We've got all the things we need for movement. We've got scientists, we've got Al Gore, we've got economists, we've got policy. The only part of the movement we forgot was the movement part, and now we need to build that. So we started in this country, and we did this thing called Step It Up in the spring of 2007, and we had 1,400 simultaneous rallies, and a lot of you helped with that and so many things. And it was actually worked, 3 days after all those rallies, all in all 50 states. Both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama changed their energy platforms and adopted this 80% by 2050 goal that we were feeling very smug, frankly, until 6 weeks later the Arctic started to melt. And by the time that melt was over, by the time Hansen had written his paper, we knew that A, those targets were out of date. What happens in 2050 is not of so much interest anymore. What happens in 2020 is what really counts, and sooner. And we also knew that we weren't going to be able to deal with this not one light bulb at a time and not one country at a time. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with it one planet at a time, which was a little daunting because global organizing is not something that happens very often. It's a difficult thing to do. The globe is a big place, and people stubbornly insist on speaking their own language everywhere. And that causes no end of trouble, as you try to think up a slogan or something to go around the world. Happily, daunting as that report of Hansen's was, it did give us one tool, that number 350, and Arabic numerals actually cross boundaries pretty easily. 350 means the same thing in Shelburne and Sao Paulo, which was good. It allowed us to at least start trying to organize. When I say we, and this is to sort of give you hope if you're feeling daunted in any of the things you're working on, when I say we, in this case, I mean me and 7 kids who had just graduated from Middlebury the year before. Now 7 was a good number because there are 7 continents, so each one took one. And the guy who took the Antarctic also took the internet because it's kind of its own continent. And off we set. And organizing in our case meant finding people like ourselves, a lot of young people, people not necessarily environmentalists, people interested in food, in health, in war and peace, in human rights, in all the things that are most deeply threatened as the planet starts to unravel around the world. And, it was, we had no idea really if it was going to work. We'd set a date, October 24th of last year, as the kind of date for everybody to try to come together and see if they could make it happen. And we gathered in New York a couple of days before, maybe a week beforehand, to do the last minute stuff, put out press releases and things, but mostly to sit by our laptops and wait and to see what would happen. And we got the first sense that it was going to work actually 2 days early, on Thursday, October the 22nd. Is a call came in from these 2 sisters, 18 and 19 years old, in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Now we've done these training camps all over the world for young people, in Turkey for Central Asia, the Caribbean, one in South Africa for people across the African continent. We brought 1 or 2 kids from each country, and most had never been on a plane before, whatever, but they were great organizers, and they fanned back out across Africa. We didn't hear from them much for the next 6 months because the internet's still pretty notional in Africa. You can't just Skype people all the time. But we knew they were working, and that Thursday we got a call from these 2 sisters in Addis, and this woman Isha was on the phone with me, and she was like, "Mr. Bill, I'm so sorry. The government has told us that we can't do this on Saturday." Ethiopia has a not nice government. We can't do this on Saturday.